Hello viewers, this is Imran Nada with ELMS Sports Foundation, joining us today for the second interview in our series of ongoing conversations with elite athletes, coaches, and high performance experts is Dr. Oleksandr Krasilshchikov. Oleg, as he's fondly called, is a professor of exercise and sports science at the Universiti Science Malaysia, and he's also the high performance consultant at the Nadiad High Performance Academy in Gujarat. This initiative is a joint initiative between ELMS Sports Foundation and Sports Authority of Gujarat as a public-private partnership project. So welcome, Oleg. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Imran, and all the listeners, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, great. Oleg, obviously you've had a long and distinguished career in sport. You've done your PhD, you have a successful teaching career in Malaysia, and you've got loads of experience, on-field experience as an applied practitioner across 3 different countries, Ukraine, Malaysia, and India as well, right? So just to get the ball rolling, would you mind telling us a bit more about your journey as well as how you got involved in high performance sports in the first place?
Yeah, thank you, Imran. It's good to be present in your interview, and thank you for the question. To be precise, it's actually 4 countries because, I was born in Soviet Union, okay. And then, of course, it was Ukraine there as a part of it. Mm-hmm. But the whole journey actually started back then, and it so happened that my parents actually were pretty much active physically, and they also kept me active. And my journey into sports science actually started as an athlete. So I joined swimming first. For 3-4 years I was in there. Then after a short break I joined another sport, which was kayaking. And actually my journey started there. So I was active athlete and quite a potential junior. And then it so happened that I started being a subject for sports scientists who were doing some sort of research. And, I started learning that stuff from both angles, like from the angle of a participant and from the angle of a subject. So that is how it went into coaching and into degree in coaching, and then further in postgrad in sports training methodology, and then into teaching. And it was always a bit of research involved one way or another. So the journey is still on and going on fine. So as you can see, it's just started from a kid athlete and is now in academics and research. And it was actually always a bit of each involved, different proportions though.
Right. So first you started off your journey as an athlete. The experience was great. You wanted to continue it as a career and found avenues in teaching and research. It's excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm curious to know more about how are you managing to balance both being a professor at the university, which is a purely academic role, and also taking up a number of on-field consulting assignments as you are now with ELMS and the High Performance Academy in Nadiad. How are you able to balance both of these priorities?
You see, Imran, as I just mentioned, both academics and research were present in one way or another throughout the whole career. If I look back at the career development, it actually had 3 distinct parts. One was in Soviet Union then, and then Ukraine, where academics and research were more or less like 50-50 when I was a young lecturer, because apart from teaching, there was always involvement in, we called that then sports science provision groups. And I was in charge quite for a while with that sports science provision to some national teams, including canoeing, kayaking, and rowing. So in Ukraine, back then, it was like 60% of academics, 40% of research, and that's sports science.
Right.
Then the second part was in India, where it was like roughly about 70% of sports science and 30% of teaching. And now it is again in Malaysia. It is, I would say, 70% of academics and 30% of research and sports science. However, if I wasn't involved in research or in sports science, teaching would be kind of quite bookish, you know. That two things are actually feeding each other, and I'm happy it's happening that way.
Excellent, excellent. So let's keeping your focus on your involvement with various assignments in India. Your first assignment was way back in 1988, right? So it's been 30 odd years since you first got involved in India. Looking back in the length of the period of time that you've been associated with various projects in India, what are some of the most important changes that have happened in Indian sports which you believe have had significant impact on Indian athletes and their performance at the international level?
Well, thank you for the question, Imran. Yeah, it's weird even to think that 30 years ago, well, it was a while. There's been a while. Yeah, see, I was lucky in 1988 to 1990. That was my first assignment in India.
Right.
They were realistically very, creative executive administrators with the Sports Authority of India who were actually developing various talent identification schemes. And what is happening in India now was a lot actually founded back there, like NSTC scheme, for instance. I was among the group who were actually developing the battery of tests and norms and standards. We did few good things. We did few mistakes, I have to admit that, back then. One particularly was using international selection standards for Indian kids. That was a wrong idea. We kind of changed it later, on the later stage. There were other programs I've been involved, Height Hunt in Gujarat, the water sports selection in Kerala. They were realistically very, very bright programs which actually delivered a good number of medals in the international level. What is happening now, of course, some of these programs contributed to the current situation in the country. However, one basically not very productive approach was existent then, and it is still existing now, to actually pick talented children according to their performance.
Okay.
Which is actually I would say, a limited potential idea. Why so? Because when you check the performance of 12, 13 or 14 years kid, even if it is there, it does not necessarily mean that the same kid has a potential to reach international level.
Correct, yeah. And that athlete might be peaking too soon, or that might be the limits of his ability, his or her ability.
Exactly. So that is why, and Gujarat is also, and I'm lucky again and happily contributing that at Gujarat, we are trying to develop a kind of multifaceted approach whereby performance is just one only factor to be taken into consideration.
Okay.
Opening other issues like anthropometry, psychological status, physical fitness status, kind of potential of achieving high performance in future. And we are actually kind of also involving coaches very actively into that. So we look at the multiplicity of those factors, let's say 5, in which performance is just one.
Right.
And being a winner is not actually guaranteeing a kid, or it should not actually guarantee a kid a berth or a seat in the academy. There are supposed to be other factors. By observing which we are protecting actually that selection from picking current performers which may not have a potential for future. So that is a difference, and we are trying actively to actually rectify that thing in Gujarat particularly.
That's amazing and interesting that you mentioned it. I'm curious to know, like, who would play the major or leadership role in selection per se or talent identification programs? Is it the coaches who needs to, particularly within the Indian context, need to be the driving factor, driving force, or the sports scientist with all the other factors that you've mentioned, them also playing a very important role, keeping the long-term picture in mind? So within this Indian context, who do you think is the right stakeholder to take the lead?
It's a good and deep question, Imran. Thank you for asking. I'll put it that way. See, I would say quite often the selection is done based on just performance, be it timing or whatever measurable or non-measurable thing. And it actually means that coaches or scientists are not involved.
Correct.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
It actually means that whatever results are achieved, listed,
Right.
assigned, go ahead. And it's not supposed to be that way. We are actually trying to involve, as you rightly asked, coaches, number one, because who but coaches can see by their own eye the potential. Coaches may not have sophisticated equipment. Their best equipment is their eye and their experience. They know things. You know, it's like in a movie. I see things. So they know things. They may not always be capable of explaining that, but they know. And actually, we are working on that with coaches in Gujarat. We make lists, we make potential issues. Coaches are trying to describe it. It works. Scientists as well. Scientists, however, their role in the initial, we call it talent identification, and then followed by talent confirmation. Talent identification may happen without scientists. It's not a big deal. But when we talk about talent confirmation, and that is about 1, 2, 3 years after original identification of a talent, scientists must step in, because none of the so far existing talent identification methods are foolproof. Mistakes happen.
Right.
The younger you pick the kid, the more is the probability of a mistake, unfortunately. So coaches supposed to be there, followed by scientists, and then all together in a very complex manner. A kid has to be absolutely perfectly described as current performer with the potential, current not very high performer but still with the potential, and if that is the case, we are actually supposed to pick on the basis of potential, not on the basis of performance.
Interesting. That's really relevant in terms of the current conversation, not just in India but across the world. And you mentioned that when you're picking kids as potential athletes who could do well at the international level, there seems to be no consensus in terms of what is the ideal age for kids to actually be considered in terms of concentrated, specific athletic training and development. So, and you've worked across different countries, you've been involved in the development of the talent ID system in India. At this point in time, do you have come to a consensus of what the right age is for different sports? And if so, then how does that play as a factor in the long-term development of the athlete?
Imran, the age issue has been, fluctuating in various countries within decades, from the slogan "Catch them young" to the position of "Don't do early specialization," to the issue which I have been involved multiple times, particularly in India, catching, sorry to use that word, but involving athletes of 14, 15, 16 years of age in sports like rowing, and delivering an Asian Championships medal in 4 years' time.
Right.
So 14 to 18, why not? So there is again a multiplicity of issues here. And it has been developed, that point of view has been developed years ago. Let's say there is a very well-known and accepted term, optimum age for top performance.
Right.
And that optimum age is different in different sports.
Correct.
We have to admit that.
Mm.
If a gymnast is achieving Olympic level at the age of 18, you have to count about 10 years back, and then you'll get the age when to pick that kid.
Right.
So it is 7 or 6. If a marathoner is achieving his first great success at the age of 23, why not pick him at 13, which again gives you 10 years kind of time to achieve excellence internationally? Why picking him at 9? There is no reason. Because when we pick those kids early, we have to do something with them. And the trend typically is overexposing them.
Absolutely.
To training, to other activities, to competition. And if we keep overexposing them, they kind of burn out early. They reach kind of high performance earlier than the optimum age. Because what is optimum age? Optimum age when you are physically, mentally, psychologically, socially, whatever other things, you are rock solid to beat the world.
Absolutely.
And that's going to happen then. Because you may be achieving physical, no. Skills, okay, possibly. Psychologically, still not there. Socially, hanging somewhere between the higher education and, some other issues. You cannot beat the world kind of champions when you are not kind of ripe.
Correct.
So that is why we say, okay, statistically, when we check the optimum age of top performance in rowing, 26, easily 16 years you can pick a kid.
Okay.
Check the sprinters, 24, 26, minus 10. And 10.
When you talk about the 10-year period, is this in reference to the 10-year, 10,000 hour Malcolm?
Yeah, you're right. It's actually in the reference, but I've been joking about 10 years and 10,000 hours. It doesn't actually work in sport.
Absolutely.
And I actually presented recently on one international conference on that, showing what are the options. So so when I say 10, it's like again to give an easy count, but I will still say it is between 8 and 10, and it's never 10,000 hours. It's roughly 6 to 7.
Okay.
Practically and professionally, I can explain that, but it may take time.
So it's like a broad general rule just to figure out when is the right time for a kid to actually start training in a particular sport, right?
Correct. But again, if I may, interrupting you, see the top performance sports very seldom see people who at say 10 started as a swimmer and at 20 became an Olympic champion. Many kids are migrating between various sports.
Absolutely.
Star athletes like, okay, Usain Bolt. He started as a cricketer. And before becoming a sprinter, he could try 1, 2, 3, whatever sport. So it's not that linear. So there are migrations inside. So, however, that's why you can say it can be 10, but someone started as for instance, a badminton player. All right. Then after 2 years, he started being an athlete. And then within athletics, sprint, jumps, this and this and that. So it's not that linear as many scientists are actually showing in the book. It's not. It's a roller coaster.
Yeah, and kind of like, so being more specific, talent identification and talent development. Obviously, one critical aspect is to choose the right talent. But having done that, having identified the right talent, maybe, and it's not like an exact science from what I gather, like it's a hunch, maybe you've looked at certain parameters, but okay, here's a bunch of kids who we feel might be a good fit for a certain sport. But then talent development is the space where you are actually working with those kids in order to make sure that they're realizing their potential, right? So, leaving aside, playing different sports or, focusing on one sport per se, but in terms of abilities, if we just talk about abilities within the phase of talent development for those identified athletes, what are some of the key abilities that, someone going through the system, having been identified, and then going through the training mechanisms, what key abilities, whether it's technical, psychological, social, or even life skills, that must be developed before that athlete is ready for international competition, so that they can be consistent at that level?
All right, Imran, it's a good question. It's kind of not that simple one, of course. You see, that actually brings us back to the understanding of a potential.
Right.
Because whenever we face a kid who is entering kind of the long and quite complicated route to top performance, we see that kid. That kid may be not strong enough, may not be, kind of skillful enough. But the issue here is that right at the beginning, we need to see some prerequisitional issues, like prerequisites.
Right.
I'll give you just one or two examples. For instance, if you are talking combat, boxing, wrestling, okay, taekwondo is different bit. See, the issue is not in skills or in physics or in physique. It is, for instance, in psychological profile. I'll give you an example. For instance, why Thai boxers suddenly became Olympic champions and world champions. There was no coincidence, and there was no secret. And apart, of course, from the fact that they were exposed to good training, and actually Cubans did that part, the boxing coaches from Cuba, they were all over the world. The issue was in Muay Thai. And Muay Thai is a centuries-long art of Thai boxing, which not only develops the skill, but it develops mind. It develops sort of kids who have no fear, who doesn't realistically feel pain. So they are focused, and they need to be physically developed, armed with the proper skills, tactics, and technique. Everything else is already there. If it is not there, you'll never be a champion. That is one issue. And that is why in some sports I'm suggesting, and that's what we do also in Gujarat, there are certain sports where you need to invite perhaps a psychologist right at the beginning to see if that kid has a psychological or mental status which will help him advance in something like combat, because it is a brutal thing, and it requires a very specific psychological profile. Now, if you take a hockey player, for instance, you can say, okay, he has to run, he has to do this, he has to do that. Coaches will say, why? Give him a stick, give him a ball, and see what that kid can do with that stick and ball. He doesn't need to hit the goal. He doesn't need to give an accurate pass. Just see how his hand is, how he is actually operating. Let it hit. See how the ball rolls, how they say. You're a tennis player. Eye-hand coordination, for instance. It can be developed, but if it is not there originally, it may not be there, and it will be hard to develop. Or you take, for instance, gymnastics. It's a routine. Man, I cannot remember 3 or 4 turns when I'm driving in an unknown place. They'll say, turn left, turn right, I maybe will get lost after 3 turns. I don't remember any. And I'm not sclerotic. Now imagine a kid who has to remember 1 minute, 30 seconds of a routine, which has 25 elements, music, implement. There has to be some movement intelligence involved.
Correct.
And that can also be assessed, and that can also be quantified. Or sometimes people ask, ooh, how these coaches in gymnastics are making these kids so flexible. They're not. Coaches has nothing to do with that. They pick flexible kids. They pick kids who are more flexible than anyone else. They can do split, they can do anything. Later, they can fix that flexibility, add power to it, speed to it, coordination to it, provided there is a reasonable intelligence there. So it's realistically a very complex thing. However, as I say, coaches do have that knowledge, they do have that mantra, they know how to, and then we from the sports science, we are trying to help them as much as we can.
Excellent. At this point, is it okay if we can generalize between sports which are skill heavy versus sports which require dominant physical characteristics, and then
Yeah, that'd be fair.
determine talent ID, or rather give more preference to one aspect over other, depending upon what the sport requires. So like you said, I know in a sport like gymnastics, where your innate or genetical abilities, also your innate ability to be flexible, precedes the other technical developments which can be worked upon by the coaches. Vis-a-vis a sport like hockey or other sport like cricket, where you're very, very skill intensive, skill focused. Now, maybe coaches or talent ID specialists are giving more priority to look for that as a thing which already exists, and then on top of that build other things. Is that a fair way to classify different sports and ways of identifying talent for them?
Yes, Imran, that would be generally correct. There'll be a bit more branching. However, yeah, generally the approach is correct.
Okay. And what is your take on across sports? We've seen that increasingly the typical profile of an athlete who's capable to deliver performance, or rather push performance in that particular sport to world record and Olympic record levels, are like very, very determined characteristics in themselves. Even if you look at middle distance, long distance runners, now we know sort of an accurate profile of what that athlete should look like as a complete product. We look at basketball players and what's happening in the NBA, the increasingly taller heights, the minimum height criteria that one needs to have even to be considered or have any chance of being part of the NBA. Then we look at other sports as well. They're very, very specific and identified physiological profiles. So in a scenario like this, where people can be identified based on the physical characteristics, how well they will do at the elite level, what happens to the general population who may not have that sort of a gift and cannot be typically slotted into these different sports? Majority of Indian population may not easily fit into one or the other mold. So what is your approach and opinion how we can do that for ourselves as a country?
All right, thanks, Imran. Again, it's a deep and partially philosophical question as well. So, yeah, if you look at humanistically at performance sort of a pyramid, we typically say that the widest part of it is known as sports for all, right? Whereby everyone is welcome, everyone is invited, and there is no issue of talent identification. It's more like physical activity, and it can be actually shared between physical education and schools, which is actually contributing a lot. And if India improves on that issue, that'd be a great help to top performance. Maybe even if it sounds surprisingly, but it is that way. Because actually school physical education is that tank from which coaches are come fishing for talent anyway. Whether there's no other place, right? So eventually they're coming to school. So one part or one branch of it is school physical education. Another one is that sports for all, whereby every kid can be exposed to any sort of sports activities. And that is when talent scouts, or we call it talent detection, starts. Because talent detection starts observing the kids who are not involved regularly in sport. They are just doing something. That is where talent detection happens. And this is where, after talent detection, and we quite often call that approach, there are two basic approaches. One approach is pick a kid for a sport. Like you say, you're looking for a basketball player. Of course, you will look for a tall someone. That is picking a kid for a sport. Or the other, which is like more, I would say, a bit more humanistic, you pick a sport for a kid.
I see.
Meaning that in the classroom, every kid is one way or another talented. And then you are not sending them all out because there is only one tall fella. And you say, okay, this is my player, he's a basketball player, everyone else do what you were supposed to do. Then you say, okay, I see, for instance, 10 kids, and out of these 10 kids, 7 are talented. One may be good for table tennis, another one may be good for volleyball, another one may be good for taekwondo, another one who is beating everyone every now and then, he might well be a good boxer. Why not? So then the whole thing turns a bit differently. However, it's a very complicated issue. So, but if you do go through that talent detection thing, and at some point in time, we just, in a good meaning, tag a kid. Okay, he may be good for throwing. See, we never pay attention to big kids, overweight kids. Why not? He may be a great thrower in 10 years' time. Or he can be a weightlifter again in 6 years' time. Why not? Everyone is somehow looking for agile, quick, and what? That's about it.
Correct.
Which is actually narrowing the whole search into a very kind of interesting thing. Because, see, again, kids which are quick at certain age, they are typically short in height.
Right.
So if you pick a quick one, you will have a smaller kid. The taller ones are clumsy. Then what? So that is why that whole thing should be perhaps quite some time bit differently oriented, and starting from the school, where physical education teachers could have their notes, anything on earth, and send these notes somewhere. State sport authorities, anywhere, doesn't matter. So that coaches eventually can pick someone who is actually detected through that talent detection system and say, okay, why don't I try that kid in athletics? Because again, in athletics, you have runs, you have jumps, you have throws. You can try that kid anywhere. And for instance, the I would say, it's not a new approach, it exists for years together, that athletic coaches are actually exposing kids to sort of a decathlon type of training. Meaning, they try everything. And then eventually, they see which sport or which event is actually fitting better. That kid fits better. So that is known as, for instance, we call it talent orientation. Yeah, you are an athlete, but what exactly you are in athletics? Or if you are a swimmer, what is your event? Correct. That is known as talent orientation. So that is how. So, and again, realistically, what actually I'm doing in Malaysia, I was also advising National Sports Institute, the Department of Talent Development. And again, see, Malaysia is a limited human resources country, only 26 mil. You cannot compare it with India. Right. So I was just telling them, look, you cannot afford selecting a kid for a sport. You have to practice selecting a sport for a kid. Right. You don't have that many children available in the first place. So, and then migration, talent migration, the one who is proven talent into something, you may well not be only utilized in some sport, you may well migrate to some other sport. I know the instances here in Malaysia where rhythmic gymnastic coaches had a list of phone numbers from other coaches, from Taekwondo, from Wushu, from somewhere. And these coaches were actually begging, telling, look, if someone is quitting as a rhythmic gymnast, call me. That the kid is quitting, I will come and pick that kid. Why?
Yeah.
See, the job on flexibility is done, the job on other issues are done. So coaches were actually hunting for the dropout.
Correct.
And this also is one of the features which, of course, hard to imagine in India, but it may also be one of the ways how to actually broaden the whole thing.
And that really perfectly leads into my next question is like, what are some of the ideal and most successful talent ID programs across the world? Obviously, there are differences in countries in terms of availability of resources, human resources, but also the ability to spend, identify talent across the different regions. But if you look at best practices and then see like what are the things that are out there which we are currently not doing, but we can certainly adopt, given the context of India. You mentioned how you recommended talent transfer from one sport to another. One example that comes to my mind is the way UK sport has been doing a lot of talent transfer.
Exactly.
That was very fairly popular, seems to be talked about as the podium scheme. So where elite or rather aspiring football players who will not be making to top level football are proactively encouraged to try out for the Olympic sports, because then again, like you mentioned, they've developed certain athletic capabilities which can easily be transferred for other sports. So is this something which, and if not this, are there other talent ID programs across the world because of your experience? You feel like, one area or certain other areas from these can definitely be applied to India and which we currently are not doing?
Well, again, thank you, Imran. It's a good question. Brits actually played a pivotal role in the development of that particular issue of talent transfer.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to admit they actually did it for a very simple reason. Because they were hosting 2012 Olympics,
Right.
and with the limited human resources,
Right.
they could not possibly achieve what they achieved without maximizing each and every single seemingly even minor thing. So they did the whole complex thing. Of course, like, okay, almost everyone does it. India, of course, is an exception. They naturalized some foreign athletes. I mean, okay, it's acceptable practice. However, they also maximized that talent transfer program. So what shall I say? I mean, it will not be fair to say that they had to do it, but eventually they had to do it. And see, the problem with India, of course, it's not a problem, is that India has unlimited human resources. And it was not realistically an issue or an approach which was even discussed in India. However, what I was recently discussing in Gujarat with, again, Nadiad Sports Academy, it's not only that availability or limit of human resources actually driving the whole idea, but it's not necessarily works at the level of the whole country. Because if you take Gujarat separately, it's not a big state. Okay, it's a big state, but human resources wise, it may not be that kind of perfect. It is also having its own limitations. So perhaps at the state level, we should treat the system not as unlimited human resources, but rather limited human resources.
Interesting.
And even if the whole country goes like pick a kid for a sport, at the state level, we perhaps should go a little bit more picky and choosy and say, we pick a sport for a kid. And then we go kind of a little bit left, a little bit right, and then try to adopt whatever system. Because typically, a system with unlimited human resources, like take Russia or take India or take China, these countries are running completely different systems of talent identification as compared to Malaysia or UK or take another country with limited population. So these countries are more on, I would say, generalization. So they will take a bunch of kids and say, okay, combinations of factors. In this kid, allowed to suggest that he might well be good in team games. Combination of other factors for this kid, we may try him in individual games like table tennis or badminton. This kid looks like he can be a rower because anthropometry of endurance or strength, so and so and so and so forth. So it is not that I'm always saying that we should not pick someone's model of talent identification and apply it at some other country. It doesn't work that way. So you kind of get bits and pieces from other systems and adjust it accordingly to your population. Because as I said, years ago in STC, someone said, okay, we will take German norms or Russian norms. And everyone like, okay. But then eventually you cannot do that. Yes, you take the norms for elite athletes, they are supposed to be international because they have to beat each other. But when you pick a kid at talent identification, the norm has to be national or even a state because you are picking from among these kids. You cannot expect someone in the state to be at Bulgarian norms of gymnastics. It is not possible. So the issue is that, again, what I'm also encouraging quite often researchers, particularly in India, I said, look, people, please stop doing PhDs on university basketball or volleyball teams. It has a very limited potential. You better, examine your own children longitudinally, 9 years of age, 10, 11, 12, see growth and developmental pattern, and then develop norms, develop standards. Then sport authority of state or a country will be eternally grateful because you can help them in actually seeing, okay, what 95 percentile is, what is plus 2 sigma, what is minus 3 sigma, so you know exactly what are you looking for. Absolutely. So that is the issue where, again, the physical educationists and the coaches and administrators have to sit around the table and say, okay, people, why don't we squeeze the best talent of the state population and then adjust that population into the sports where the state has a potential. We had a great discussion with Mr. C.V. Som. He is now appointed as Sport Authority of Gujarat Director General, and he is Senior Secretary, Principal Secretary of Government to India. He asked a very simple question: which sports we have a chance to develop to the Olympic level in Gujarat? Right into the bull eye. Of course, fine. So it has to be like what you were actually suggesting, and we were discussing that. Accuracy, absolutely. Coordination, absolutely. Big anthropometry, questionable. Big functional capacities, possible, but then nutrition kind of related. Combats, yes, but different weight categories. And as you know, in some combats, there are not necessarily fights, but there is also katas, which is demonstration.
Correct.
Why not? So you're actually moving towards that whole thing, and holistically speaking, I hope we reach there one day.
Hopefully, we all are praying for that. Hopefully, we'll reach that stage sooner rather than later. One final question, and we've already talked about it a little bit in your final answers. But the purpose behind all of these interactions and interviews is obviously one, to understand because we are competing with the best in the world, what is best practice in the world, learn from that, and also learn from our own experiences in the past. We have had both of these experiences. You know what is the best in the world outside, and you've also worked very closely with the Indian system. And now there is much more consensus and realization that India needs to play the long-term game. We need to focus on 8 to 10 years down the line. Our honorable sports minister recently also talked about, focusing on the 2028 games, being more prepared for that. So if you look at, the kind of conversations that are happening in the country right now, the focus on the long term, even if you have to focus on the long term, there are immediate steps that need to be implemented now, which go on up until the 8 to 10 years and then give results, right? So, in addition to what you've shared with what can be done state specific and sport specific, what other things, what are, some milestones or benchmarks we can look forward to starting from now, so that 8 to 10 years down the line, we'll be able to produce consistent champions?
Well, yeah, it's again a good question. Certain things are happening already, and I'm happy those are happening. And one, as you mentioned at the beginning, that PPP, private-public partnership, and ELMS is doing a great job in that regard. And thank you for giving that opportunity to me as well to contribute. Picking the strong points from both governmental and private organizations, and then their visions and their actually pace of developing is contributing a lot, in fact. And one such thing has been recently concluded in Gujarat, and Nadiad Academy, I guess, is the first, if not in India, I think in India, which actually passed the ISO certification, which is a headache, of course, one way. But another way, it is actually a sequence of operations. And the strong point of kind of ISO certification is that certain steps have to be replicated, and certain things has to be repeated, corrected, like you said, experientially corrected, and so on and so forth. And that contributes a lot. So discipline and actually fulfillment of certain operations and certain sequences which are effective, that is also important. One thing, however, which always cripples a lot of efforts is that, unfortunately, for years together, and a bit improvement is there, but it is still in a kind of poor shape. National associations are very poor on planning. And they are not just poor on planning, they keep postponing things, they keep kind of changing the dates for the competition, they keep moving them forward, upward, this way, that way, and that brings a complete havoc and disaster to the planning part, which has to be there for achieving top performance. One of the conversations we had with my last executive director teams, Major O.P. Bhatia, back there in India, he said, Alex, yeah, our project officers are doing things, they're doing good, they're sooner or later doing what they have to do. And my simple response was, look, sir, sooner or later is not an acceptable term in top performance, because Asian Games are happening at a particular day, at a particular time, and it will not be postponed. So we have to bring medals back right there. And if on the way to that something happens sooner or later, it doesn't fit. It has to happen on time, on schedule, when it has to actually happen. And it actually goes about training, about equipment, about exposures, about competitions. And when you change one national competition date then the whole thing goes kind of wreck.
Correct.
Because you have to replan everything, you have to readjust everything. So if we reach one day, and of course, sport to sport is different, but it will not be fair to say that every national association is lousy. I don't want to say that. But there are the ones which are punctual, there are the ones who are good, but then there are also the ones which are really kind of careful. And that leads to a problem with periodization. Coaches doing good job, athletes are doing good job, scientists are doing good job, but then suddenly they say, okay, we are sorry. That competition is now postponed for 3 weeks time. Then what are we supposed to do? We are picking a kid to perform in 1 week, and then we have to extend that shape in 3-4 weeks time. Yeah, scientifically we can do that, but then practically it is not that simple. It may not happen. So actually the country altogether is improving. The partnership is working great. So it will definitely bring some good improvements. However, I keep saying that there are issues which have to be tackled on the top level, like in the country by the minister or by the ministry, because one thing, if we have a solid, not changeable competition calendar, yes, then locally we can adjust equipment, we can adjust exposures, training exposures, competition exposures, and we can actually pick an athlete at a particular time and a particular day to actually to perform. And trust me, we are trying to pick all the bits and pieces of good theories and some effective issues, mold them into some local approach, and we do have some good local approaches which we, with the help of ELMS and of course with the help of SAG, we may just try generalizing it. Like we have a good contact with Kelo India. We do kind of exchange views on that quite often. So perhaps we can also, send them some feedback on talent identification, on talent detection, or how to make our job on the state level also kind of a bit more comfortable.
Wow, that's fantastic. Amazing. Thank you so much, Oleg. This has been wonderful. You shared your views on a range of areas, particularly focusing on talent ID and development, which is in many ways the first step to achieving international success for India. So hopefully we'll be able to continue to improve ourselves in this particular aspect and other areas. Thank you once again for taking the time to do this interview with us.
Thank you, Imran. Thank you for inviting and letting me share some thoughts, and I'm sure we will reach there quite soon. Thank you so much.
Well, on that note, we are going to end this interview here, and we wish Oleg the very best for all his future endeavors, but also more importantly, we hope that he will continue to contribute his valuable insights towards Indian sports in the coming years as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks again.